everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode.
You know, the situation with Ukraine and Russia feels like it's constantly shifting, but a recent idea floating around really grabbed me. The U.S. potentially stepping back from being a key player in peace talks, I mean.
Yeah, I saw that. President Trump put it pretty bluntly, didn't he?
He really did. Suggesting if either side makes finding a settlement very difficult, the U.S. might just say, and this is a quote, "You're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people."
Wow. That kind of statement, well, it feels like a real potential turning point, doesn't it?
Exactly. One that could send, major shockwaves through this conflict. And across the globe, really.
It certainly does. And understanding the forces behind this potential shift is precisely what we're diving into today.
Okay.
We've looked at statements from U.S. officials hinting at this change, some in-depth analyses of the aid the U.S. has been providing, and even the latest on how American public opinion is reacting.
For getting the full picture.
Right. You're looking for a clear and thorough picture without getting bogged down, and that's what we aim to deliver.
Great. So let's dig deeper into that tough stance we heard from President Trump. But it wasn't just him, was it? Secretary of State Rubio sort of echoed that.
He did, yeah. Reportedly conveying the president's view that if a truce didn't appear doable, relatively quickly, the U.S. might just move on.
Move on. That's quite a shift from President Trump's earlier confidence, remember?
Yeah.
He talked about brokering a ceasefire rapidly, first as 24 hours, then 100 days.
It's a big contrast. And what's fascinating to consider here is the White House's apparent, growing frustration.
You think so?
It seems like it. Those initial efforts to get a ceasefire haven't really gained traction, mostly because Russia keeps rejecting various proposals, even pauses in fighting.
Right.
And reportedly, President Trump has expressed his, let's say, dissatisfaction with both sides for this lack of progress.
Yeah, he hasn't held back on the frustration. But then, almost simultaneously, he kind of downplayed any idea that Russia was manipulating Washington. He said, nobody is playing with anybody.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and then we're going to see if we can get it done. I think we have a really good chance of getting it done. It feels like a bit of a head scratcher,
It does. Tough talk on one side, but then this optimism about a breakthrough.
How do you square those? Could it be different strategies at play?
Yeah.
Maybe trying to pressure them?
That's a really crucial question. The strong rhetoric suggesting disengagement, it could be a tactic, right? To pressure both sides to be more, amenable to negotiations.
Okay.
But at the same time, keeping that public belief in a possible breakthrough, that might be about keeping diplomatic channels open. It's a complex balancing act, for sure.
Definitely complex. Okay, let's pivot now and look at the actual support the U.S. has been providing. We always hear these huge figures, billions and billions, for U.S. aid to Ukraine.
Right, massive numbers thrown around.
But some analysis suggests the real value, especially the military stuff, might actually be, considerably less than what's being reported.
Yes, and what's particularly insightful here is how this analysis looked at the numbers. They didn't just take the headline figures.
They dug deeper.
Exactly. They got into the specifics of the military equipment, tracked the types of weapon systems, how old they were, how much they depreciated in value.
Depreciation, that makes sense.
And importantly, whether the aid was a grant or a loan. So their estimate for the real value of the military assistance comes out around $18.3 billion.
18.3. Compared to the 60+ billion often mentioned.
Precisely. It's a significant difference.
That is a massive difference. So what accounts for such a large discrepancy? Is it just accounting?
Well, a primary factor is how the U.S. values the military gear transferred under the Presidential Drawdown Authority. That lets the president send existing U.S. military equipment directly.
Okay, I know that mechanism.
So standard accounting might use the replacement cost, what it costs to get new versions. But this analysis looked at the actual current value of the older equipment being sent. Some of it wasn't even actively used by the U.S. military anymore.
So older stock.
Yeah, they pointed to, for example, older Stryker armored personnel carriers. A vehicle from, say, 2011 or 2012 just isn't worth the same as a brand new one off the line.
Makes sense.
So essentially, a significant chunk of this older equipment had very little, maybe even zero, remaining financial value to the U.S.
Okay, that's a key distinction.
And this difference in valuation, it's not just an accounting detail, right? It suggests Ukraine might not be getting the level of impactful military hardware that those big headline figures imply.
Which could affect things on a battlefield.
Potentially, yeah. And it might mean we need to reassess what sufficient aid really looks like.
So it's not necessarily all the latest and greatest tech being sent over.
Exactly. Now, the total estimated monetary value of all U.S. aid delivered, including direct financial support, is around $50.9 billion, according to this analysis.
50.9 total.
Right. And of that, $32.6 billion was direct budget support. That's used to reimburse verified expenses, like pensions and salaries, through World Bank accounts. And some was collateral for loans.
And have there been audits on that? Questions get raised sometimes.
Oh, yeah. It's worth noting these funds have apparently undergone extensive audits, and no evidence of misuse has been found.
It's good to hear. And what about other types of assistance?
The analysis broke down the other categories too. There's direct funding through international accounts, straightforward loans Ukraine has to repay.
Right.
Using funds as collateral for bigger loan packages, Treasury account grants for U.S. defense procurement, though the actual benefit to Ukraine there is estimated lower because of restrictions.
Okay.
Indirect equipment transfers, like investments in Poland's defense industry, where only a fraction directly helped Ukraine.
Yeah.
And even the Lend-Lease program, which surprisingly hasn't actually been used.
Really? Lend-Lease wasn't used, huh?
Apparently not, according to this breakdown.
So when we hear those big aid numbers, it's really critical to understand the breakdown and the actual present-day value, especially for the equipment.
Definitely.
And it sounds like when you factor all this in, the U.S. might have provided less overall aid than Europe and maybe a comparable level of military aid relative to the size of their economies.
That's a key insight from the analysis, yes. It gives a much more nuanced picture of the U.S. economic commitment compared to other allies.
Okay, now let's shift focus again. What does the American public think about all this? There's been polling, right?
There has. And recent polling indicates, actually, a significant increase in the number of Americans who believe the U.S. isn't doing enough to support Ukraine.
Oh, really? Not doing enough. That's interesting.
Yeah, this particular poll showed 46% of Americans now hold that view. That's a new high, and a big jump 16 percentage points since December.
Wow.
And interestingly, the proportion saying the U.S. is doing too much has actually decreased. It's down to 30%, and 23% think it's about right.
So where's that shift coming from?
It seems to be largely driven by increased support among Democrats. 79% of them think the U.S. isn't doing enough. And independents, too. 46% of them feel that way.
Okay. So even with some prominent Republican voices, expressing concerns about the level of aid, public sentiment, at least in certain groups, seems to be leaning towards more involvement.
Exactly. Though, it's important to note, a majority of Republicans still believe the U.S. is providing too much assistance. But even that sentiment has seen a decline.
Interesting dynamics. What about the goal? Helping Ukraine reclaim territory versus ending the war quickly?
Yeah, the poll touched on that. There's a slight overall increase in support for prioritizing Ukraine regaining its territory, even if it prolongs the conflict. That's at 53%. Seeking a swift end, even with potential territorial concessions, is at 45%.
Close, but tilting towards regaining territory.
Overall, yes, but this is where we see a clear partisan divide. Most Democrats and independents favor reclaiming territory. Most Republicans prioritize a quicker resolution.
That makes sense, aligns with other things we see. And how do Americans see the war itself? Who's winning?
Well, the poll indicates a majority, 63%, still believe neither side is winning, holding steady there.
Okay.
However, there has been an increase in the percentage who now think Russia is winning. That's up to 26%, the highest recorded in this survey series.
That perception could definitely influence the debate about U.S. involvement levels.
Absolutely.
Did the poll touch on trust, like regarding potential peace agreements?
Yes, and this is quite revealing. There's widespread skepticism about Russia's commitment to any peace deal. 79% of Americans are concerned Russia would violate an agreement.
79%, that's huge.
It is, and in contrast, there's significantly less concern about Ukraine violating one, only 26%.
Big difference.
And furthermore, a majority, 64%, would support sending more weapons to Ukraine if Russia did violate a peace agreement, though support for direct U.S. military intervention remains lower.
Okay, so there's a deep-seated distrust of Russia's intentions on peace, but a willingness to keep arming Ukraine if Russia breaks a deal.
That seems to be the sentiment reflected in the poll, yeah.
Now, moving to another point of, maybe, friction. It seems some allies of President Trump have been pretty vocal, criticizing President Zelensky. even suggesting he might need to step down.
Yes, that's been reported. It's a pretty strong stance to take publicly about an allied leader during wartime.
It really is. What do you think the motivation is behind that kind of criticism, pushing for concessions?
That's a crucial question. This criticism, well, it likely stems from a desire among some in the Trump sphere for a swift resolution to the conflict, even if that means Ukraine making concessions.
So criticizing Zelensky is a way to signal that.
Possibly. It might be an attempt to signal a shift in U.S. expectations, maybe pressure Ukraine to adopt a more compromising stance in future negotiations.
We heard specific examples, right, like Mike Waltz.
Yes, White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz reportedly called Zelensky's behavior in their meeting incredibly disrespectful.
Wow.
He even drew a comparison to Churchill, suggesting Zelensky might not be ready to transition Ukraine to an end to this war and consider, territorial compromises.
And wasn't House Speaker Mike Johnson also quoted?
He was, stating Zelensky needs to show gratitude or perhaps a different leader is needed to negotiate. And Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard also mentioned a huge rift in the relationship.
That's a stark contrast to the widespread international support Zelensky has generally received.
Indeed. And we have heard counter-arguments within the U.S. political scene, too.
Right, like Senator Murkowski.
Exactly. Senator Lisa Murkowski criticized this type of stance as walking away from our allies and embracing Putin. Senator Bernie Sanders has reiterated strong support for defending Ukraine.
And Langford.
Senator James Lankford also cautioned against calls for Zelensky's resignation, warning it could destabilize Ukraine at a critical moment. So definitely a clear divide in opinion there on how to approach Zelensky and Ukraine's leadership.
It's fascinating that amidst all these apparent tensions, the talk of withdrawal, the criticism, the U.S. and Ukraine have a preliminary agreement on a minerals deal.
That is interesting, isn't it? It seems like practical cooperation is still happening on some levels.
So what's the deal with that?
Well, despite the political friction, there's a memorandum of intent to set up an investment fund for Ukraine's reconstruction, and it's linked to Ukraine's significant natural resource wealth.
Natural resources.
Critical minerals.
Exactly. Ukraine has significant reserves of critical minerals, which are undoubtedly of strategic interest. Now, there have been reports that President Trump has shown interest in a deal where the U.S. might share in profits from these resources, kind of as repayment for aid.
Tying aid to resources. That seems to be part of the discussion. Apparently, talks are in the final stages, and a formal deal could be signed soon.
So even with potential pullback on peace talks and the public criticism, there's still this economic dimension, the strategic minerals angle, keeping things connected.
It appears so. A very layered situation.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, we have to consider Russia's perspective and its actions in all this. What's their take? What are they doing?
Well, Russia has accused Ukraine of intentionally delaying progress on any truce agreement. That's their line.
Okay.
And President Putin has rejected proposals for a full ceasefire if they include conditions he sees as undermining Russia's military advantages. Can't weaken their position, basically.
Right. Any talk of progress from their side?
The Kremlin has said there's been some progress in peace talks, but they also acknowledge that communication with Washington remains difficult, challenging.
Militarily.
Militarily, Russia has continued its offensive, launching significant missile and drone attacks across Ukraine. We've seen reports of particularly devastating consequences and casualties in Kharkiv, for example.
Terrible.
And President Zelensky has stated that Russia is increasingly targeting civilian infrastructure now.
More civilian targets.
That's the claim, yes. And one more thing, Russia issued warnings about potential escalation if Germany sends those Taurus missiles to Ukraine. They view that as direct German involvement.
So continued military pressure, accusations of stalling, rejection of certain ceasefire terms, and warnings about escalation.
That sums up their recent posture pretty well.
It paints a picture of, well, a deeply intricate and dynamic situation. You've got multifaceted political maneuvering, shifting public opinion, these debates about the real value of aid, and of course, the ongoing devastating military conflict.
Absolutely. So just to summarize the key takeaways, we've got the U.S. signaling potential disengagement from peace talks if things don't move quickly. We looked at analysis suggesting the real value of U.S. military aid might be lower than the headline figures. We noted U.S. public opinion shifting towards favoring more support for Ukraine.
Yeah, that was surprising.
We highlighted the public criticism of President Zelensky by some U.S. figures, alongside that ongoing progress on a minerals deal.
What a minerals deal, right.
And lastly, we touched on Russia's continued military actions and its stated negotiating positions. A lot of moving parts.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What stands out most to you in all of this complexity? This potential shift in U.S. involvement feels like such a critical juncture, and the global implications are just, well, far from clear.
It certainly does feel pivotal, and it really prompts a significant question, maybe for you, for our listeners to consider. Given everything we've explored, the nuances in aid valuation, the shifting political winds, the public mood in the U.S., what truly defines enough support in a conflict like this?
That's the core question, isn't it?
It really is. And maybe more broadly, what are the long-term consequences of these differing perspectives on aid, on leadership, on strategy for international relations, and how we approach conflict resolution globally in the future? Something to mull over, perhaps by digging deeper into some of the reports and analyses we touched on today.